Hello, everybody. There we go. Hi, everybody. So it's been a long time since I've done this. I've been somewhat busy since then. Life has been very good to me. I'm about to get married. Well, in like 5 months, 4 or 5 months. So I proposed. She said yes. I'm getting engaged, and I have a little bit of the sniffles, as you can see. But so since I last posted, I've been enjoying Hawaii, coming back here, doing all sorts of wonderful and sundry things. However, it seems like I'm the only one that's been having fun because seems like the United States federal government went to the crapper for a while. We got out of the shutdown as a part of the shutdown, though, and then as pretty much everyone knows at this point, the only reason we had the shutdown was because President Trump wanted funding for the wall, right? And during these conversations, as I'm sure almost anybody who's watching this and everybody out there knows, President Trump said, "Hey, look, I can just declare a national emergency and build the wall." And everyone said, "Well, wait a minute, that seems like a very bad idea. That seems unconstitutional." And I'm here to basically tell you that while I personally am not really the biggest fan of the wall, looking at it from a legal perspective, I think President Trump probably can declare a national emergency. And here's the thing, there was a second argument that was given, which was if President Trump declares a national emergency on building the wall, then what is to prevent a President Harris or, God forbid, a President Ocasio-Cortez or President Sanders, any Democratic president, from saying, we've got a national emergency on global warming, climate change. We've got a national emergency on climate change. We've got a national emergency on healthcare. We've got a national emergency on, name any number of Democratic kind of policy talking points, right? And that we can use that national emergency declaration to, by fiat, effectively impose our plans. I'm here to tell you there's no way that can happen if Trump declares a national emergency. First off, let's just before we even get to the legal analysis of that point, the very fact, if you follow the logic, right, the logic goes something like this. President Trump is going to declare a national emergency. That national emergency is going to be the modus operandi by which he gets a wall built. Once he does that, other Democratic politicians will get the idea to do the same thing. There's an already glaring flaw in that argument. And the glaring flaw in that argument is if the idea is what triggers the Democratic Party to have their ideas to sort of impose their national policy programs by fiat, then why haven't we already crossed that precipice? If your argument is effectively that the Democratic Party or president whatever is going to impose their economic program by fiat now that we've had this discussion, the very fact that we've had the discussion has already triggered the idea. Which means at this point, even if President Trump were to give a very long and meandering speech about the importance of the separation of powers, which, yes, separation of powers is very important. I believe in it wholeheartedly, as I'm about to explain. It wouldn't matter because the idea is already out there. So what's to prevent any president, any Democratic president, from doing this in the future? Nothing. Somebody's already put the idea out there. The idea's there, right? It's now that it's there, it's not going to go away. You can't unthink an idea or unspeak a word. So we're already at that precipice. If your argument is really that the very mere discussion will trigger this, then we're already there. The discussion has already triggered the idea democratically. By the way, I'm also cross-posting this on YouTube, so once I get done with this, I'm going to put it on my YouTube channel, which I will also link, because I'm trying to get hits on the YouTube channel and see if that goes anywhere. Also, I apologize, I've got a rather sniffly nose. So, anybody listening to this, apologies. So basically the argument's already flawed, right? Trump could do nothing vis-a-vis national emergency declaration, and we could still be in the same situation 4 or 8 years from now, or sorry, I guess technically 2 or 6 years from now, right? So already the argument's bad. But let's talk about legally, right? I'm a lawyer, right? I do the legal thing. So here's the problem with the national emergency declaration. Here's why a President Harris or President whomever would fail. it's not so much that the president doesn't have broad powers to declare a national emergency. Those broad powers have generally already existed. But Congress already dealt with this problem back in 1976. You may all remember, or many of you have heard, a guy named Richard Nixon was president at one point. Now, Nixon has probably one of the most complicated legacies of any president. He did a lot of good things, but he also was very Nixonian, especially domestically. Obviously, Watergate, that's the big stain on his legacy. And the thing about Watergate, right, the thing about Nixonian politics is that Nixon was very heavy-handed with his use of executive power. So much so that after 1972 happened, after he resigned, a Congress came to power in 1974 and said, hey, look, a lot of these things that Nixon is using executive power to do are nonsense. So we need to stop that. So by 1976, that new Democratic class of 1974 passed in both the House and Senate the National Emergencies Act. By that time, President Ford was in power. President Ford, eager to not look Nixonian in any way, shape, or form, signed it into law. So the National Emergencies Act directly deals with this problem. It says that there's no such thing as a perpetual declaration of emergency. In other words, if the president declares an emergency, within a year, the emergency goes away unless he renews the declaration. Right? The second thing it does, and this is the most pertinent thing, is that in that declaration of emergency, the president has to specifically outline what congressional powers he is going to use, what statutory powers he is going to use. When we were talking about doing this through Trump's wall, as an aside, I do think the president's going to declare a national emergency on this. I don't think he's going to get anywhere in his declaration with Congress. And I don't necessarily think the Democratic Congress has an interest, especially if they think they can use this idea in the future, for negotiating with the president on wall funding. And, you talk to the Democratic base, they feel very strongly that this wall they just feel it's very immoral, right? I mean, you've heard the other arguments from the Democratic side about how it's not effective border security and that, and they may believe those arguments, but I think the one driving, animating principle on the left is the idea that the wall is immoral. That's the one animating principle. So, I'm not a fan of the symbolism of the wall, admittingly. I do, however, think that we should do something for border security, and I think that some money should be spent for that. And if that includes, if there's no way that we can't get to it without some sort of barrier, I think that should be part of the discussion. So I guess you could call me agnostic on the wall. Agnostic leaning against, but my opinion on it can be very changed. And I do think that the GOP is very heavily invested in border security, and I think that they have every right to be, right? So, but I also think, just as an aside, that there should be a comprehensive immigration reform. I think we need that. I think there are too many Americans, too many resident aliens, too many illegal aliens in this country who have been here for a very long time. I've seen it in my own practice, and they deserve to be brought out of the shadows. Right, they've been here for too long, and I think at a certain point, if you've dropped the ball so many times, we need to find a way to let those people legalize their entrance into the country. So, that being said, getting back to the legal analysis for the wall. So anyway, back to the National Emergencies Act. The very second thing it does, most importantly, is that it builds, or it forces the declarer of an emergency to cite a congressional power. When we were talking about wall funding a month ago or 3 weeks ago or whatever, Trump mentioned using the Department of Defense, using the military to build the wall. The reason he did that is because there is a specific code section which says, in a declaration of emergency, the president can use the military to build military construction projects, right? Which effectively the wall is. That's all this is for. So, that congressional power has existed. Congress has already given President Trump the ability to do that. Even if he wasn't President Trump by then, and it was somebody completely different, that power still exists. It hasn't been repealed, right? Imagine trying this for something else. This is where the problem lies. Okay? President Harris, or whomever, President Warren can declare a national emergency and say, we don't have good health care in this country. Can you use the military and use a military construction project to fix the insurance industry? No. No. You can't name me a specific power granted to the president by Congress that the president could invoke that would address those ends. So, for political sake, one could make the declaration. But in that declaration, what powers of Congress are they going to use? There isn't any. Right? Like, yes, Congress has established a Medicare program. Yeah, absolutely. But Congress hasn't established within that Medicare program a specific clause that says that the president can expand the program. They did, however, give the president the specific authority in declarations of national emergency to use already appropriated military funds to build the wall. Right? The Congress already resolved the constitutional problem with an emergency declaration by saying you can declare all the emergencies you want, but you have got to use congressional powers to push that funding. Right? There are no congressional powers for universal health care. And let's talk about climate change for a minute. Yeah, I mean, there are a load of congressional powers that deal with that. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, so on and so forth, right? The problem is the president already has a wide amount of latitude under those programs already, right? It was Obama who used the Clean Air Act to basically deem carbon dioxide a pollutant and to use that and to use a metric system, essentially, or to use that metric as part of a system, not to be confused with the metric system, to punish coal companies, to punish his perceived environmental offenders. You don't need a declaration of emergency for that, right? You don't need a declaration of emergency under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. You can do politics as usual. President Obama did. So, a declaration of emergency sounds a lot worse than it actually is, because we have already prepared constitutionally, legally, to limit presidential powers in that event. So whatever your opinion is on the wall, like I already told you, I'm generally against it, willing to talk about it, and whatever your position is on illegal immigration, which is, I think we definitely need to reform it, because there's too many problems with it, and I see that every day as a defense attorney. President Trump using a national emergency invocation will not be a constitutional crisis. The slippery slope argument made by even people I really admire and respect, like Senator Rubio, right? That slippery slope argument doesn't apply. Like, there are already dams put in place to prevent that from becoming a reality. So in short, basically, declare all the national emergencies you want. As long as you don't have any congressional power to do anything with it, it's meaningless. It's a meaningless declaration. So the slippery slope won't happen. We're not going to have an executive king. We're not going to create King Harris if we create King Trump, so on and so forth. That's just not true. Legally, it's impossible. And I don't use that word lightly. It is legally impossible, given the structure of law in this country, to do something like that. Speaking of other things that are going to soon be legally impossible, let's talk about New York for a minute. So New York is a really weird state. Like, super weird. And I say that because New York's worse than California. New York is worse than California if you're a gun owner, right? In California, if I bought a gun, I could bring that gun to my house and keep it in my house. And as long as as long as I don't do it in a way that is going to cause children harm, I'm legally fine, right? In New York, you have to actually get what's called a premises license in order to get a gun. And as in New York, not only do you have to get that premises license, but in order to get that premises license, you have to not only have no criminal record, but you also have to have no mental health history. However New York defines that, right? I don't think it just means seeing a therapist. I think it means probably like schizophrenia or something like that. But you also have to, apart from those two things, be adjudged to be a person of moral character, right? Like of good moral character. And that's extensive. And that's problematic when you have an amendment to the Constitution that says that you have a right to keep arms. But more importantly, keep and bear arms, which will become important in a couple of minutes. So, we, so New York, so for the first time in like a decade, the United States Supreme Court has said, "Oh, we got a problem here." The problem specifically arises because in New York, a couple of individuals who are part of some NRA competitions own guns, and they own guns in New York City. New York law is really weird because in New York law, it basically says, look, you can get a premises license, and that premises license will give you the ability to transport guns from your home in New York City to a shooting range. And at first, that sounds really like, okay, cool, like that's what the law should be. The problem is New York then defines a shooting range to only exist in New York City, right? So they call it a short-term intermediate shooting range. But they only define permissible shooting ranges to be in New York City, which means if you are a New York citizen and you live in New York City, you live in New York City, and after living in New York City, you want to transport your guns to a shooting range out in Albany, out in Ithaca, right? You can't. Right, and I think this was a poor drafting law because the law started out by basically saying you have the ability to have a carry license, right? But the carry license only allows you to carry within New York City, or it allows you basically you can get a carry license aside from it. So basically, so here's the deal: there's the premises license which carries within it kind of a implication of a carry permit. And there's also a carry license that you could get to carry it from one area to another. And then, so you have these people, they want to carry their guns. This guy has a house out in, I forget where, but it's out in like upstate New York. And he wants to carry his gun from New York City to his house. New York City no longer has a implied carry permit, which means this guy has to apply for another carry permit to do this. Right? And he's basically like, well, I can't do this. Or, as the Second Circuit noted, he can apply for another premises license for his other house. This is silly. This is onerous. Right? So the United States Supreme Court took this case, and they're obviously going to overturn it. Justice Thomas, a year ago, criticized the Supreme Court for not taking gun cases. I imagine he's probably one of the at least minimum 4 justices that decided to hear cert on this. This law is problematic for a couple of reasons. One, the Second Amendment says you have the right to keep and bear arms. Those are 2 separate rights. It creates 2 rights, not 1, but 2. The first right is the right to possess a gun. That's arguably discussed in New York's premises license. And if New York had denied the plaintiffs in this case a premises license, the owners, or the potential owners in this case, would have standing to sue. And that would probably be overturned. Because if you have a right to keep guns, right, that right should not be subject to licensure. A license is the exact opposite of a right, right? A license is when the state says, we are giving you the ability to do something that you normally cannot do. I have a license to practice law. I earned that license through a life's worth of legal loans, of school loans, about 3 years worth of legal study and 4 years of collegiate study, and then an extraordinarily rigorous bar exam, right? There is no way I have a right to practice law in California. I have a license. A license is something that is earned. A license to drive, you have to take a test. You do not have a constitutional right to drive. Sorry, if you're a sovereign citizen and you're watching this, no, you don't have a constitutional right to drive. That's wrong. Long point of it is, I'm trying to basically show you what a license means legally. It means something you work towards, and something that's given by grace of the state, so to speak, right? It's the exact opposite of a right. A right is something that is inherent to your existence as a human being or as a citizen. In this case, as a citizen of the United States of America, you have that right. And so, and I don't want to belabor the history, but basically 10 years ago, the United States Supreme Court said, yeah, actually, you have a fundamental individual. That was the debate in Heller, is whether that right was individual or collective, and the court said it was an individual right. And then a couple years later in McDonald v. City of Chicago, the court said that Second Amendment applies to the states as well, through something called the incorporation doctrine. I won't belabor the points. I've done it before in another Facebook video a long time ago. Basically, it just means that federal guarantees also apply to state governments, right? And that's by way of the 14th Amendment. So because of that incorporation doctrine through the 14th Amendment, the Second Amendment applies to the state of New York. Right, so the state of New York already has a problem here when it has a premises license, because a premises license is the exact opposite of the right to own a gun. If they had denied that license, that would be an issue in this case. I think at some point when they do, it's going to be deemed unconstitutional. The other problem, though, concerns the second right of the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. That's different from keeping arms, right? When one keeps something, they usually keep it in a private place or on their person or whatever. Bearing arms is more of a social activity, right? Bearing anything is a social activity. It requires the ability to take something from place A and put it in place B, right? So when you bear witness to something, you are taking the truth as you know it, assuming you're bearing true witness, and you are taking that truth to a place, usually a courtroom or a deposition, and you are testifying, right? So when you bear something, it's a social activity. You're talking in relation to society writ large. And if the framers had wanted anything differently, they would have just said keep arms. They say keep and bear arms, and then further explain that was done for national defense or to the purpose of raising a militia. And I know there are some arguments there. Those arguments were dealt with in Heller. They're not going to apply in this case. That's all we need to know for now. In other words, you can't really restrict the Second Amendment to national defense, right? The Supreme Court has already said no dice on that. And in fact, reinterpreted it really to mean self-defense. So for me, what I think is going to happen with this case, what I think is going to happen with the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to overturn this, because New York, in addition to having this onerous and unconstitutional premises requirement, also has an onerous and unconstitutional carry requirement, right? Again, you should not need a license to carry a gun. Now, you might need a license to carry a gun in a specific way, but New York has doubled down on this and basically said, no, you can only get licenses for ranges in New York City. Or you can otherwise apply for a license in a whole separate other procedure where we basically we go through your same moral qualification. Right? That process is onerous. That process is unconstitutional. I am not saying that all forms of anti-carry laws are constitutional, right? But I am saying creating a heavily restrictive concealed carry requirement in addition to prohibiting open carry is unconstitutional, and New York does that. New York does both of these things. So they basically make it impossible for somebody living inside New York City to carry their guns outside of New York City. Because, that's the problem. In New York City, you can't get a carry permit. So you have to kind of do it by grace of the commissioner. But the only grace that commissioner can extend is to shooting ranges in New York City. Right? So if you're in New York City, you literally have no legal way to get your guns outside of New York City. And I suppose the only way to do it would be an onerous carry permit requirement. I'm not even sure. I think the law was horribly drafted, right? It's hard to get your head around because of how badly drafted this was, right? They basically created a separate law for New York City citizens. And they basically said, okay, well, if you're in New York City, you don't have to apply for a carry permit as long as you stay in New York City. Well, not everyone who lives in New York City stays in New York City. Right, hence, you have the problem. So the Supreme Court will overturn this. I think they'll overturn it on Second Amendment grounds. I don't think they'll find a jinky statutory way to get out of it. And so I see this law being overturned because there is a right to publicly or privately bear an arm. Otherwise, the right does not really function for the purposes of self-defense. It's not just the right to possess something. It's the right to possess it and to hold it. Right? And that holding only makes sense if done in a social function. Otherwise, the right makes no sense. So the United States Supreme Court is going to rule on something like that. And they are going to invalidate New York's law. And New York's law, by the way, for anyone who's curious, New York's law is infinitely worse than California. Like I said earlier, in California, you can get this gun. You can get a gun, own it, keep it in your house, and you don't need a license for that. You can just get a gun. You just have to pass a criminal background check. That's it. New York does far more than that. And in California does, and I think this will also be an issue for future purposes of constitutional litigation, California does have very onerous carry requirements. They have an open carry law. They have a concealed carry law. Some states don't give a concealed carry permit. Some counties don't give a concealed carry permit. So in California, and this is inevitably going to make its way to the Supreme Court too, California, there are certain counties where you basically can only keep your gun in your house. That's it. Because they have a rigorous, basically will not issue. Some counties is the opposite, like Stanislaus County, fairly easy to get a concealed carry permit. So, in short, this litigation from New York will affect California in that way, right? Depending on how the Supreme Court rules, they will say something along the lines of, look, you've got to give some legally accessible avenue to carry a gun in some way. If the Supreme Court says something like that, California is going to have to change its laws. Maybe not immediately, but they will eventually. I suspect they might say something like that. And if there was any way for the court to nix the premises requirement in this case, they would. That to me is more offensive than the carry thing. The carry thing is just bad legal drafting, right? Somebody didn't realize that, oh crap, people might leave New York City, so we might want to give them a legal way to carry their guns with them, right? That's all that was. That's just badly legally drafted. But to prevent somebody from owning a gun after they go through a rigorous process is the anti-right. It's the exact opposite of a right, and I've explained why earlier. So, long and short of it is, I'm going to try to get back to these more often. I try to do them as much as I can. I've been busier at work, which I suppose is a good thing, and just busier doing some extracurricular activities, which I also suppose is a good thing. So anyway, thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, like I said, I'm going to put this on a YouTube channel, so if you want to rewatch later or show it to somebody later, just let me know. All right, peace.